guys, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to be recommending to you 9 more dark fantasy books with morally gray characters. So a while back I made a series of fantasy recommendation videos, and one of the videos from that series that seems to have done really well, that you guys seem really interested in, is a video where I recommended dark fantasy and fantasy with morally gray characters. This is something I really enjoy reading, and I think in that video a lot of my recommendations were YA with some adult, and today I have more books that I've read since then to share with you. This time, actually only one of these books is YA. All of the rest of the books that I want to share are written for an adult audience, and they include a variety of different types of fantasy and speculative fiction. But if this is something that you guys are looking for, hopefully this is helpful. And if you haven't seen that original video and are looking for even more recommendations, I think in that one I had 11 books to share. I will link that video up above if you want to check it out. The first book that I want to recommend to you guys, and one that I think I even had a couple of comments on the fact that it was missing from my initial video, is a book by Joe Abercrombie. He is kind of the king of grimdark fantasy, and yes, I have now finally read a couple of books from him. This is The Blade itself, the first book in the First Law trilogy. So if you are looking for morally gray characters, I think this is a really great place to go. The reason that this is considered grimdark is less because it's the most dark and most violent sort of fantasy that I've read. While that is there is darkness and violence, the main thing is just that none of the characters are really heroes. There's not some heroic goal or some quest to change things for the better. That's not really what this is. This has more of kind of a gritty, politically realistic feeling to it, but in a fantasy world. And the thing that really shines here is some of the characters. The plot of this is slow. So if you're looking for something that is fast-paced and really action-packed and plot-driven, this is not where you're gonna find it. This is much more driven by the characters, and I will say some of the characters in here are stronger than others, but the ones that he does well, he does really well. The one that I would say is my favorite is Glokta. Glokta is just such a funny and fascinating character. He's this man who's been disfigured after having spent years being tortured and then released, and now part of his job is to torture and interrogate people for the kingdom that he now lives in and works for. And he's just snarky and funny. His internal dialogue I was like living for. He's one of my favorite characters that I read in a book in 2019. So if you're looking for some of that, if you're looking for like a darker, grittier fantasy with really strong, interesting characters, I would definitely recommend checking out something by Joe Abercrombie. My next recommendation is the one YA book that I want to share with you guys today, and this kind of straddles the line between fantasy and horror. This is Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand. I absolutely loved this. This is kind of like Stranger Things meets Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but scarier, super feminist, and very queer. It follows 3 main characters who are girls on this place called Sawkill Island, where something is kidnapping and killing teen girls, and there's a lot of creepy things going on. This one is definitely a blend of fantasy and horror. I loved everything about it. If you guys are looking for something that is very feminist and kind of like crush the patriarchy with queer representation, this is a really good one to check out. This one does include a female-female romance with an on-the-page sex scene and a asexual character. I just really loved it. I thought it was scary and empowering, and I really liked it a whole lot. So if that sounds appealing to you, go check it out. Next up is one that I really enjoyed, but it might not be everybody's cup of tea, so take that as you will. And this is one that I did listen to via the audiobook, and I think that was a beneficial choice. This is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This is her first foray into writing for adults. This is kind of a slower paced urban fantasy. It is set at Yale and involves secret societies and ghosts. And this is a very dark and very heavy book. It deals a lot with sexual assault and sexual abuse, with a lot of pretty explicit and difficult content. with that, there's a lot of violence and violence towards female bodies, but I really loved this. This is one that people kind of seem to love or hate. Again, it is more description heavy. I didn't mind it. I liked it. I did like the audiobook version of it. I liked the way that it was handling these issues of sexual assault and sexual abuse, and the ways that powerful people get away with things, and the ways that institutions of higher education have sometimes been a part of allowing people to get away with that because they are powerful. So yeah, I was a fan of this. I do plan on continuing on with this series. I would recommend trying this via audio if you listen to audiobooks. My next recommendation is another book that falls into this kind of grim, dark fantasy category. And while this wasn't an all-time favorite book for me, I did really like it, and I plan on continuing on in the series. This is Blackwing by Ed McDonald. So this is set in kind of a post-apocalyptic fantasy world, and the main character is a bounty hunter. It's in this world where there are powerful beings that are kind of godlike who are at war with each other, and humans are kind of caught in the middle of that. I liked this. I thought it was really interesting. It wasn't, like I said, not a perfect book for me, but one that definitely sucked me in pretty quickly. I think it did a great job of weaving world building into the narrative pretty seamlessly, which is not easy to do, especially as a debut author. So I think he did a fantastic job of that. Generally, I think if you're looking for those morally gray characters, darker fantasy, this is for sure going to give that to you. And I thought that the characters were really interesting here. My next recommendation is one that maybe could be classified more as speculative fiction, but I think it kind of fits here. This is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. So I really liked this. I thought it was interesting. And again, with the morally gray characters, you are getting that here in spades. So it follows two young men who were roommates and rivals in college who discovered a way to develop these extraordinary abilities that come at the expense of your soul. And now, years later, their rivalry has come about anew, and there are people being killed, and lots of things are happening. And I just think it's really interesting. It's a very interesting exploration of morality, because you might end up rooting for one of these two characters over the other, but neither of them are really moral, but they're both the hero of their own story. So I just think this is really fascinating. If you want something with the fantastical elements to it that's exploring gray morality, I think that this is definitely a good one to pick up. My next recommendation is the first book in a historical military fantasy series that is quite dark, but I think really brilliant. Another one that's a very strong debut. This is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This book is quite intense, really interesting. It follows a girl who wants to train to be part of the military. Some people didn't love it because they thought it felt kind of choppy. This does definitely have distinct parts. The first part of this is this girl getting into this military training school that ends because a war begins, and then it's her going to war. And so those have two very distinct feelings between each section that are quite different. So part of this book is inspired by real events in Chinese history, the rape of Nanking, and so there is a chapter later in the book that contains a lot of very, very difficult to read content based on things that really truly happened, wartime atrocities that were committed against men, women, and children. It is one of the most difficult to read passages that I have read. It is a small part of this book, but one well worth knowing exists before going into this. However, I think this is really, really well written. In all cases, this is quite dark. Again, we're getting morally gray characters, and I just think it is phenomenal. So I think if that's something you're looking for, definitely worth picking this one up, but do know going in that it's got that passage I mentioned that is based on real wartime atrocities that occurred. One thing that I will say though about the way that it's written is it doesn't feel like it's kind of glorifying those events or try to be like, ooh, look how shocking this is, which you do sometimes get. It feels more matter of fact and is horrifying to read, but doesn't feel like it's just there for shock value. So anyway, I would definitely recommend checking this out, The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. My next recommendation is the first book in a trilogy. I've so far read the first two books and love them. I actually love the second book even more than the first. This is Red Sister by Mark Lawrence, the first book in the Book of the Ancestor series. This is just a really, really fantastic adult fantasy series featuring assassin nuns as the main characters. This is kind of the perfect balance, I think, between being character-driven and plot-driven. There's a lot of action and a lot of plot, but such great characterization, and I've got to say I'm really impressed with Mark Lawrence. This has an almost entirely female cast of characters, and they're so well done. There are not that many male authors who do this good of a job writing female characters, and Mark Lawrence I just find to be really impressive in that way. They feel like people, they feel fully fleshed out, they don't feel like stereotypes, and there's mystery elements to this. I loved it. I'm really excited to continue on. I have one more book. Holy Sister is the last one in the trilogy that I want to read, and then this year he's coming out with a new series that is set in the same world, which I'm very excited for because there's a lot that we still don't know about the world, and I would love to read more in it. So definitely recommend this. Again, it's got kind of darker elements to it. It's got morally gray characters who are fascinating and wonderfully well done. Definitely one I would recommend checking out. My next recommendation is kind of a sci-fi fantasy blend. I loved it. This is not one that was going to work for everyone. It seems to be kind of a polarizing book, but I just thought it was such a fun time. This is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. So this has been pitched as lesbian necromancers in space, which is kind of true, but it also contains a closed circle murder mystery. It's got a lot of body horror, and Gideon, the main character, is just this snarky, funny character, and I loved her. I think if you don't like Gideon, you're not going to necessarily enjoy this book because I feel like a lot of what makes this such a good time hinges on Gideon as the character sort of driving the force of the book. I was a huge fan. I thought this was so much fun and so interesting. I enjoyed all of the elements of it, and I'm very much excited to continue on in the series and see where else it goes and learn more about this sort of dark world that she's created. This is another one that is a pretty, I think, impressive debut novel, and I think Tamsin Muir is one to watch. She's got a really imaginative approach to world building, and this definitely feels fresh and not like a lot of stuff that I've seen before, so I really liked it. And the final book that I want to recommend to you guys is a 2020 release. This originally was an indie published novel, but has recently been picked up by Tor and published traditionally, and I really loved it. It's kind of a horror fantasy blend. This is Burn the Dark by S.A. Hunt. I thought this was such a good time. It follows a punk YouTuber who's a witch hunter, and she films hunting witches, except that it's real. This also has some like Stranger Things vibes to it, with this kid and his group of friends who have things that are going on. It's funny, it's fun, it's diverse. It's got some super creepy moments in it where there are real horror elements to it, but then sometimes the horror is just the fact that this is set in the South and there's racism and homophobia that is happening. Yeah, I really, really enjoy this. I'm super excited to read book 2 because you get a little bit of a cliffhanger at the end. So I'm really excited to see how this finishes up. I think it's going to be Duology, the Malus Domestica series. And the lore about these witches is kind of interesting. And if you're feeling bad for these witches getting killed, like, you know, they are murderous witches, most of whom have lived for a really long time, so I wouldn't feel too bad about them. They're pretty creepy, and there's monsters. There's a really creepy scene that takes place in a public restroom in the middle of the night where no one else is around. It's great. It's a whole lot of fun. Really enjoyed this. So yeah, that is my final recommendation for dark fantasy with morally gray characters. So there you have it. If you had run out of books to read after watching my previous video, hopefully that'll give you some new recommendations and series to check out. I really enjoyed all of these. I think they're fantastic. For me, they're everything between a 4-star read and a favorite of the year. So yeah, definitely recommend them. Hopefully this video is helpful and gives you some sense of which of these might work for you or not. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on the books that I talked about today. And for your question of the day, let me know what is one of your favorite dark fantasy books. I would love to hear from you, and I'm always looking for recommendations. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.